Thank you very much indeed, Gordon. It falls to me to talk about alternative voices or divergent voices in this period. It has been said, and I think it's true, that probably no Roman Catholic signed the Solemn League and Covenant. The reason being that it was so obviously a Protestant protest against Home Rule, invoking the God of Presbyterian battles. Even the leading Catholic Unionist lawyer, Dennis Henry, a later Unionist MP from 1916, a native of Draperstown in County Derry, a product of an English Catholic public school, many of whose siblings were priests and religious. He didn't sign the covenant because, in a sense, his religious experience had been that of the penal laws, Catholic emancipation, and all of that, though he's a leading protagonist against Home Rule in that critical decade that we're talking about. But there's no doubt that the Ulster Covenant stands out as one of the most significant documents of modern Irish history by threatening to invoke physical force to defeat the present conspiracy to set up a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland. It struck a lethal blow at the concept of the King in Parliament, the very basis of British parliamentary democracy. For militant Irish separatists in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, then a minority in Ireland and the Irish diaspora in America, the Covenant and its sequel in 1913, the UVF, provided an inspiration. As the historian Michael Laffan has noted, by adopting militant tactics during 1912 to 14, Carson reignited the Fenian flame of revolutionary nationalism. By November 1913, the northern-born Gaelic Leaguer, cultural nationalist, native of Glenarm in the Glens of Antrim, Professor Owen MacNeill had written his seminal article, The North Began. He wrote it in a Gaelic League journal on Clive Sullish, the Sword of Light, and he commended the example of the UVF to Irish nationalists. The North began, the North held on. God bless the Northern land, he wrote, invoking an old United Irish ditty from 1798. MacNeill's article would lead directly to the formation of the Irish Volunteers in November 1913. The scene was set for the 1916 Rising Beyond. But while the Covenant was signed by 218,000 Ulstermen and slightly more women signed the Declaration, it was not the only Northern Protestant response to the Third Home Rule crisis. An active group of Protestant Home Rulers, led by the Reverend James Brown Armour of Ballymoney, minister of Trinity Presbyterian Church in that North Antrim town, rejected the politics of Carson and Craig. Armour, Sir Roger Casement, a retired British diplomat from a North Antrim landed Protestant family, Professor R.M. Henry, Professor of Classics at Queen's University, brother of the artist Paul Henry, the sons of the minister of Great Victoria Street Baptist Church, and a host of others, produced a counter-covenant at the end of 1912. And this covenant I found many years ago in the R.M. Henry papers in Queen's University Library. In this document, the Protestant Home Rulers declared, "We, the undersigned, Protestant men and women, hereby repudiate the claim of Sir Edward Carson to represent the united Protestant opinion of Ulster, reject the doctrine of armed resistance to the legitimate decrees of Parliament, and declare our abhorrence of the attempt to revive ancient hatreds and dying habits in this province." The pro-Home Rule Covenant continued, "We desire to live upon terms of friendship and equality with our Roman Catholic fellow countrymen, and in the event of Home Rule becoming law, we are prepared to take our part with them in working for the good of our common country." Turning to the threat of partition, Armour and his colleagues declared their rejection of any proposals for the permanent exclusion of any part of our country and pledged themselves before God to work for peace and goodwill among all classes of Irishmen. And this alternative covenant attracted perhaps some 3,000 signatures, a pale shadow of the mainstream unionist document. Although the views of these Protestant home rulers, some of them were Protestant nationalists, many of them would have seen themselves as home rule liberals. But the views of them were expressed in a pamphlet published in 1911 by the nationalist MP for South Down, one of the leading home rule propagandists, Jeremiah McVeigh. He published a pamphlet called Religious Intolerance Under Home Rule. And it's the views of a selection of some 200, mainly Ulster Protestants, some in other parts of Ireland, expressing their rejection of Sir Edward Carson's tactics. And I suppose they're summed up by one man, a man called William Farrell, who's described as a substantial farmer in County Down from Ballygoskin, Killyleagh. And he writes, "For about 25 years, I have been honorary secretary of the Barony of Dufferin Farmers Association, and am intimately in touch with its members." And he recalls that this association had sent a deputation consisting of the largest farmers, all of them Presbyterians, to attend Mr. John Dillon, the Home Rule leader's meeting in Downpatrick in 1885, to show that our sympathies were with his views. And he went on to write, "We have no great dread of our Roman Catholic fellow countrymen, and when Home Rule is granted, there will be no more loyal and industrious district than the Barony of Dufferin in North Down." So you get a sense of these Protestant home rulers from that document. What we can say, of course, is that the Protestant home rulers, including Lord Perry, the owner of Belfast Shipyard, the real architect of Titanic, were instrumental in two other major events in these years. The first was the invitation to Winston Spencer Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty in the Asquith Liberal government, to address a Home Rule meeting in Belfast on the 8th of February 1912. And we can see a cartoon actually featuring John Redmond and Winston Churchill discussing his forthcoming visit. You can see the view of Edward Carson on the Falls Road during that famous month of February 1912. And here you have the famous scene of Churchill being mobbed as he emerged from the Grand Central Hotel after a luncheon with the Ulster Liberals in Royal Avenue. As a child, Winston Churchill had his first, I suppose, major encounter with Irish politics, or the Irish question. As a small child, when his grandfather was viceroy in the Phoenix Park, the family estate in Dublin, he was being led on a donkey by his old nurse when she saw a procession approaching. And she suggested to the infant Winston that these were perhaps a group of Fenians. And in the melee, Winston fell from his donkey, suffering, as he put it, concussion of the brain. And that's almost what recurred on that February day in 1912 in Royal Avenue, because the scene had been set from January. Churchill had been invited by the Protestant home rulers, led by Lord Perry, to address a rally in the Ulster Hall. Think about it. The Ulster Hall consecrated by his famous Tory unionist father, Lord Randolph, in February 1886, when he had given the incipient unionism its watchword: Ulster will fight, and Ulster will be right. Of course, Winston Churchill, had crossed the floor in the early 1900s, attracted by liberal imperialism and liberal social reform. But he was slow to embrace Home Rule. He warmed to it slowly, as Robert Blake reminds us. And yet he found himself by 1912 First Lord of the Admiralty in the Liberal government, committed to an all-Ireland measure, the Gladstonian shadow. And he was invited to Belfast. Of course, he was mobbed at Larne, he was mobbed at the Midland Station. His wife and he had dead fish heads thrown at them. And eventually, he arrived here, emerging on a very damp, gloomy winter's day in the centre of Belfast. The shipyard had taken the day off and had marched on the Grand Central. And outside, Winston, as he emerges, and you can see him there in the middle, wan looking, still trying to smile as he is about to enter his taxi. He heard the strains of Rule Britannia, and I suppose as First Lord his heart should have been gladdened by these strains, but he didn't like the way they were being sung. His wife got into the car first, his darling Clementine, and as he got in, a group of roughnecks broke through and began to rock the car violently from side to side. They were about to overturn it in this kind of frenzy of orange shipwright resentment at Churchill the traitor who had betrayed his father, when suddenly a Belfast accent cried out, "Mind the woman, mind the woman." And they saw his beautiful wife Clementine in the car. And Churchill lived to fight the Second World War. Of course, he didn't get speaking in the Ulster Hall. He was denied that privilege by the Ulster Unionist Council. Instead, the meeting was transferred to a much better place, some thought, Paradise, the football ground of Belfast Celtic, on the fringes of West Belfast, now the Park Centre. And this is a Liberal cartoon after the event, showing Carson raising the Home Rule bogey. And John Redmond is assuring a young John Bull not to be alarmed. Yes, it sounds terrifying, doesn't it, Johnny? But there's no need to be alarmed. It's only a mechanical device for producing stage thunder to excite the audience. The idea of Unionist bluster. This is Queen Victoria's nephew, Count Glycon, who commanded the Busby-headed troops at Celtic Park that day, at Churchill's meeting when he addressed 10,000 people. Gladstone, of course, the inspiration of it all. Perry chairing the meeting. The shipbuilder at odds with his 25,000 strong workforce. The great tent imported from Scotland. It at last hosted a meeting of Asquith himself. And here you have the tent at Celtic Park. Here you have, as Churchill transferred the venue to kind of assuage Unionist feelings, there's an appeal to the Orange Men of Belfast not to interfere with the nationalist meeting signed by the Grand Master Robert Wallace. And as we move on, we have a handbill of that day from the Ulster Liberal Association, Perry as chairman, Churchill, and the other speakers that day, of course, were the nationalist leaders, John Redmond and his northern deputy, Wee Joe Devlin, the MP for West Belfast. A rare photograph of Churchill addressing the meeting, Perry alongside it, and of course his beloved wife Clementine, who, as we heard last week, suffered a miscarriage because of the sort of mobbing outside the Grand Central Hotel on that day. It was not quite the last hurrah, that's the thought, of the Ulster Protestant Home Rulers. They had a final meeting in Ballymoney Town Hall on the 24th of October 1913, when 500 Protestant Home Rulers from North Antrim were addressed by, among others, the Reverend J.B. Armour, Roger Casement, and Captain Jack White, the son of the hero of Ladysmith, Field Marshal Sir George White. Jack White had gravitated from British imperialism and unionism to Republican socialism and became a devotee of James Connolly. He's remembered famously in Brishain, where he lived until his death in 1936 for two reasons. He was married twice. Both his wives were Catholics. He's remembered as the first man in Ireland, perhaps, to wheel a pram through a local village, through the village of Brishain. And the first man on the planet to leave that pram of screaming children outside the local public house because he had more urgent business inside. But that famous Home Rule rally in Ballymoney Town Hall in October 1913 endorsed two resolutions. One rejecting the lawlessness of Carsonism. This voted for by 500 local farmers, professional men from the Route, Ballymoney and the Route, sort of a liberal stronghold. The second resolution, rejecting the sectarianism which separated Irishmen and calling for the government to help to bring them together in one common field of national effort. It was very much a minority section in one corner of the province of Ulster. And that meeting in October 1913 was to be the last major Protestant protest against militant unionism and the partition of Ireland. Thank you very much.